Okay, welcome everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about second order ordinary differential equations and the Runge-Kutta method for solving them. Okay, so first of all, I want to introduce our use case here. So our use case in this case is going to be hair cells in the inner ear. So hair cells are really important for hearing. Now I am just showing a simplified drawing of them here. So these are located in the cochlea in the inner ear and are essential for your hearing. So basically what happens is these are in your inner ear, and as a sound comes in, the fluid basically makes these cilia, these very specialized cilia, move. Let's say they move some distance x from their original location, right? So you can imagine it like grass waving in the wind, right? And essentially this movement causes mechanosensors in these hair cells to send signals to the auditory nerve, which then gets interpreted in the brain as sound. So we can imagine that as we have some sound and some amplitude of sound, right, over time, let's suppose that it's just one little beep. Suppose it's basically instantaneous. We can imagine that, again, like grass waving in the wind, and our expected x, right, we might imagine that if it's just one sound or one burst of wind on this grass, we might imagine that it stays at about 0 here, right? And then it starts waving back and forth and then eventually damps out. So this is known as dampened oscillation behavior. So now let's think about how we actually model this hair cell as a dampened oscillator, right? So we want to create a mathematical equation that models this behavior, all right? So let's zoom in on one single hair cell, right? And let's assume that this is x, where this is 0, right? So when we think about these sound waves moving this hair cell, right, this actually is just a force of the sound, right? And we assume that it varies with time, right? So think about this. This hair cell is an object with some mass, m, right? And again, this is the force exerted by the sound. So now we need to think about, back to our basic physics class, right? So when you apply a force to an object of a certain mass, what is that equal to, right? So let's recall from our physics class, force is equal to m times something. Take a minute and think about what that is. So you may remember it as force equals m times a. What is a? A is acceleration. And what is acceleration, right? We might remember from our physics class that a is equal to change in velocity over a change in time, right? Now, what is velocity? Again, recall from your physics class that velocity is equal to a change in displacement, in this case, x, over a change in time, right? So what A really is, acceleration, is really just the second order differential of x, right? So we still go back to our f equals ma, but we plug this in, right? So now we have f of t is equal to d squared of x over dt squared times mass. Great. So now, while unlike in a lot of our undergraduate physics classes, we do assume that friction and or drag are in place in this case, right? Because recall, this hair cell is existing in lots of fluid in your inner ear, which causes some drag, right? So we assume that drag is non-negligible. And we are going to use Stokes' law. So this is a law that assumes that small objects in viscous fluid have a drag force proportional to velocity. So what Stokes' law actually says is the force of the drag is equal to 6 pi nu r v, where v is velocity. The other parameters are all dependent on the object itself. So let's assume that they are some constant c, right? So now we want to apply the drag force, right? Because the force coming in from the sound can go to multiple places, right? So now we have f of t is equal to mass times acceleration, right? Which we have replaced with d squared of x over dt squared. Now plus the drag force, right? So we have c times velocity, which again, according to before, is actually dx dt. Great. So we now have our accelerating mass. And now our drag force. But now, if we really think about it, the actual dampening comes a lot, if we recall this picture, right, from the fact that this is made of a lipid membrane, right? And a lot of these proteins in this membrane kind of act like a spring that will tend to bring it back towards the center, right? So it may be moving, but it will tend to go back towards the center. So here we apply Hooke's law, right? So this says that a spring applies a force proportional to the distance from the resting displacement. Right? So we assume in this case that it is x equals 0. Right? So what this says is that the force applied by the spring is equal to negative k, where k is a spring constant, times x, right? And now we apply this force as well to our force equation. So if we recall, here is our equation here. We now have f of t is equal to m times a, or d squared x over dt squared, plus c dx over dt, the drag force. Now we add just for simplicity, I'm going to call this a capital K instead. And we will just absorb the negative sign into this equation, right? We just want to keep it a little simpler. And now we just simply have x, the displacement from 0, right? So now we have this final equation that says where all the forces from that sound actually go to in the singular hair or cilia in the hair cell. So this is a second order ordinary differential equation. Or second order ODE. So what makes it second order, right? So this is because we have a second differential, right? We take the differential of x and then we do it again, right? So this is what makes it second order. Ordinary, it is ordinary because we are just taking the differential with respect to time and no other variables, right? As opposed to partial, where we take the differential according to different variables. Now, how do we actually solve this, right? So you may have learned in your math class that you can, let's suppose that we say d squared x dt squared is equal to, let me change that variable here to x double prime, right, where prime is the differential with respect to time and double prime is the second differential with respect to time. And let's say that dx dt is equal to x prime, therefore, right? So if we just change all the constants to arbitrary constants, right? So then we actually have ax prime plus bx prime plus cx is equal to some function g of t, right? So I'm just replacing all these with arbitrary functions and constants. Now, you may have learned in your math class that if it is equal to 0, then this is called a homogeneous second order ODE. And this is relatively simple to solve using principles from the quadratic formula, right? However, in this case, right, what does it mean if f of t is equal to 0? Take a minute to think about that. So, if f of t is equal to 0, then this just means that there is no sound. Now, in the context of biomedical engineering, that's not very interesting to us because most of our biomedical engineering having to do with the inner ear is so that we can help people hear again and hear normally, right? So that's not very interesting to us, right? So we are not assuming that f of t is always equal to 0. All right, so now this equation is now non-homogeneous. This is a little bit harder to solve, right? So mathematically, it's not easy to come up with an analytical solution. However, this is why we have numerical methods, right? And with the wide abundance of computers, and it's very fast to solve very tedious problems now with computers, I will introduce the Runge-Kutta method for solving this equation, right? So in this method, in many numerical methods, we assume, and also in these equations, in the homogeneous equations, we need to have assumptions, right? We need to have initial conditions. in order to solve these equations, right? Because we have too many unknowns. So we need to have knowns. So let's assume that with this hair cell condition, with this hair cell application, we know x of 0. Let's call it x naught, although most likely we're assuming we start with no sound, so it'll probably be 0. We will also assume that dx dt at 0 is also equal to x naught prime, right? So this is also an assumption that the speed of the hair cell of the cilia is probably 0 to start, but let's just leave it arbitrary for now, right? And let's assume that given x of t and dx of t is known. Assume that given these variables are known at a time t, we assume that we also know the x double prime or d squared of x over dt squared. Great. So in order to introduce Runge-Kutta methods, I'm going to introduce a simpler numerical method first, right? So let's introduce Euler's method. So let's draw this out first, right? So I am going to work in just a first order in Euler's method first, just for simplicity. But the same thing applies to second order. So let's assume that we have a plot and we know the initial condition, right? I'm going to keep it relevant to this example, so let me draw this a little nicer. So assuming we start at 0, right? And let's assume that I can solve for the differential at this point in time, right? So now I know x naught, x of 0, and I also know dx dt at 0, right? So now we want to know what is x of the next step, right? So remember, this is a numerical method, right? So we are trying to solve the problem one little step at a time, right? So now we want to know, let's say, x of h, which is a very small increment. Okay? So now we want to know x of h, right? So let's suppose h is out here, right? So again, assume that this is very small. So where is the plot at h, right? So if we know the slope at 0, and we know that h is very small, then we can assume that over this very small span, that probably the slope is pretty similar to what it is out here. So basically what we do is we just extrapolate out from that first point and go the horizontal distance h, and then we say that that slope, this dx, is equal to dx dt at 0 times h, right? So now we know that it is x of 0 plus dx dt of 0 times h. Right, so that's Euler's method, right? Now, keep in mind that this is just a numerical method, right? So it is imperfect. So maybe the graph actually looks like this, right? So we have a little bit of inaccuracy, right? So this assumes that that slope is linear, right? So this is a fairly rough approximation. So the Runge-Kutta methods are quite similar. I'm going to be discussing Runge-Kutta 4, it's very commonly used, is more accurate. A little bit more complicated, but more accurate. So let's go over that. So imagine that we do the first Euler method, right? So I'm drawing out the actual graph here, right? But of course we don't know this. I'm just drawing it for explanation purposes, right? So let's say that we're starting at some x here, and let's assume that this is h, x plus h, where again we assume a very small h. So here we know the slope. Assume again that given this initial condition, let's say that we have initial condition at x, right? We know the slope at x, which I'm going to approximate by this little blue line here, right? And let's extend that out. That is our first slope that we're working with, right? So let's call it m, just for simplicity. Let's say that we know m1 let me get rid of that. So we have m1 is equal to, so let's say that this function for dx dt is equal to some function of t and x, right? So we have m1 is equal to t naught x naught, right? So this is the one that I've highlighted in blue, right? So now we know that this is not necessarily a super accurate slope, right? But let's pretend to carry out Euler's method, right? So we will go out to actually, x plus h over 2. We will go halfway there, right? And we will stop here, right? And we have an approximation for what that value is, right? And we recalculate the slope at that point instead of all the way through, right? So now we have an m2 is equal to some function of t naught plus h over 2, and then x naught plus h over 2 times that first slope that we calculated. Cool. So now we keep going, actually, right? So we repeat this process, right? So we calculate this slope. I'm going to make this one green. So we calculate this slope over here. And then we pretend to move that slope back to where we were before, and then repeat this process. So we extend it out to x plus h over 2, right? And recalculate it again. So m3, just going to remove that. So we now have m3, I'm just going to move this on to another page. m3 is equal to f of t naught plus x over h over 2, so same thing as before. And now we have x naught plus h over 2 times the previous slope, so m2. All right, so one more, I promise. So again, we pretend we calculate the slope at this point and take it back here and pretend it is there, and then do the same thing, except we go all the way through to the end here. And now we calculate this final slope here. And we add that to our slopes here, right? This is our fourth and final slope for Runge-Kutta 4. You can imagine why it's called Runge-Kutta 4. Sorry, wrong variable. So this one is t naught plus h, so we go all the way to the end, just like we did with the first one, with the Euler's method, right? And then this is x naught plus h times m3. So how do we reconcile all of these different slopes, right? So which one do we actually use? So what we actually do, and again, this is all just for that one singular point right here, right? So what we actually do with this is we use a weighted average. So we basically use these and modulate the accuracy of that one slope, right? Because none of these are quite accurate, right? None of these slopes are quite accurate, but combining them all together will make it a bit more accurate. So we are assuming that the ones that only went halfway out are probably a bit more accurate than the ones at the beginning or at the end, right? We're assuming the ones at the beginning or the end are more extreme than the ones in the middle here, right? So that is why we have 4 of these. We give double the weight to the middle 2. So I'm calling this M final. So the middle 2 will get double the weight of the ones on the outside. So these will get a weight of 2 over 6. And the ones on the outside get a weight of 1 over 6. So now we have our weighted average. So now we solve for the next point. By saying x naught plus h is equal to x naught plus h times mf, with the m final being the above, and then you plug in everything from there. And then we finally move on to the next point. And then repeat this process. So as you can see, this is a very tedious process just for one point, and recall h is very small, so you'd have to do this likely hundreds to thousands of times to get a pretty good approximation. But this is where we have MATLAB and Python or other types of software to do this process for us. All right, so thank you for listening to the lecture on second order differential equations and the Runge-Kutta method. Thank you very much for listening.